Hi, everyone. This week I thought we'd do something a little different, but still definitely related to writing. The, the metaphor I was thinking about is let's think about the English language as an instrument, a musical instrument that we are learning to play or learning to play better in a sense. And I thought, you know, why don't I talk a little bit about where English actually comes from? Obviously, it comes from England, but the history is a little more complicated than that. So I thought I'd talk about where English comes from, and that leads us to the study of what's called etymology. I'll put up this graphic here. Uh, what is etymology? The study of the origins of words and the ways in which their meanings have changed through history. So I was thinking about where to begin this lesson, and I thought, let me just make sure everyone understands the idea of etymology before we get into the history of English. Because sometimes people haven't really spent any time thinking about how the language that they use, that they speak, and that they write, how it came to be. So let me give this easy example or a kind of everyday example of a word, this English word. Now, this word has a perfect history lesson that's fairly recent contained in it. So most of us would know that there are two meanings to this word, the new one and the older one. And let me just define what they are. By the new meaning of the word awesome, I mean that meaning of being really great or really amazing that came into use, as far as I can tell, from surfer culture in maybe the 1970s or 80s. We had an invasion of surfer language. And, you know, the surfer language and Southern California is a fascinating story if you're looking at how English has changed in the last, say, 50 years. Because for some reason, uh, Southern Californian culture, surfing culture, which, you know, I guess really began to take off in the 60s as a kind of pop culture idea. And then, of course, before that, it took its origins from Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian surfing culture. So you have this culture whose speech and accent, the accent we might call Valley Girl or kind of brah, that Southern California accent with all its vocabulary, really invaded the speech patterns of young people starting probably in the 60s, and then certainly in the 70s and really in the 80s, which is where, you know, I was a kid and I came into contact with these phrases, you know, awesome, radical, rad, gnarly. It's funny, some of these words have lasted and some of them have not, like, you know, like tubular. That was as big as, you know, rad or gnarly in the 80s, but and I guess surfers may still use tubular, but it it hasn't really lasted. Like teenagers and young people of today don't really say tubular, I don't think. And maybe they don't even really say rad or radical, or maybe they do, but they're kind of aware that it's an older word, sort of in the way I might have said, or maybe most of us still say the word groovy, even though that comes from a time where I wasn't really born yet. So, and by the way, tubular, I just have this graphic. Tubular means essentially the same thing as awesome. It means really good, really great. And it comes from the shape of a wave forming a tube that you could surf through, and that's one of the ultimate surfing experiences is being inside that tube, right? I think it's also called the green room. So okay, so back to awesome. The new meaning of awesome is really good, really great. And the older meaning was more connected to what? It was connected to a kind of religious idea of awe. What is awe? You know, it's a profound religious feeling, like awe in the face of God or in the face of creation and God's terrible powers of awesome judgment. And so this sort of religious meaning came to what might be called, regular culture, in the sense of, say, in 100 years ago, you might hear the awesome powers of the Supreme Court. So it means this very, very powerful, sort of to be feared, to be revered, all of these things. So we have awe, some, filled with awe, right? And interestingly, we have, if we are awful, if we are filled with awe, we have a word awful. Now, awful is another example of a word that's gone through a change. Because I believe, and you guys can do your own research, but I believe at one time, awful and awesome, the older meaning of awesome, were pretty similar. Like maybe a few hundred years ago, this idea of something that's large, powerful, to be revered, to be feared, those were kind of, both of these words could have that meaning. But this one changed into our modern meaning of simply being really bad. And this one changed into our new meaning of being really good. Isn't that interesting? Like one goes towards the negative side of things and one goes towards the positive. And they're kind of mirrors of each other, but they come from this word and they come from a time when they meant the same thing. So this is what I mean by, and I have another graphic here that's my visual metaphor. I mean, words have layers of meaning as you go back in time. And so my graphic here is, this is a wall that has layers of paint that have been sanded away. Okay? So within each layer, or each layer of paint, you could think of as going further back into time. Does that make sense? So if we have the current meaning of awesome is this layer, and then we go down one layer to this yellow layer, that's the previous meaning of awesome. And then we go down another layer and we might find an older meaning. And as we keep going back, we might find a time when English wasn't even around yet, but words that made it into English from, say, Latin. So these layers go back in time, and at some point they even get older than the language that you're actually talking about, which is really interesting. So I'll put up a few more graphics about that will hopefully make that make sense. Anime. So I'm going to take you through some layers of this word going back in time and kind of show you what I mean by that layers of paint metaphor. Anime. Okay. This is now an English word, but it means a certain Japanese style of animation, right? So we took this word into English from the Japanese word anime. But where did they get this word? They got it from the English word animation. Okay. So I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think it's after World War II, the animation industry in Japan, or I should say anime, really took off, and it was its own style. And we all know how many amazing movies are made uh, in the Japanese anime style. But it found its origins, I believe, in American animation of pre World War II. So maybe early Disney stuff. Okay, now we have already three layers of meaning, right? So this word has weirdly enough gone from an English word into Japan and then come back to the English speaking world to mean a certain style of Japanese animation. But let's go even deeper. Like, where does this word come from for when we first started seeing films that were drawn or painted as opposed to being, real footage of people and things? This word goes back to a Latin word. Uh, it has a few different forms. Whoops, got my N's and M's mixed up there. Okay, so we have these two words that are from Latin, which, if you know your history, is a language over 2,000 years old. In other words, older than English. Okay, so we have this word Latin. What does it mean in Latin? Well, I'm going to look at the Wiktionary here, Wiktionary.org. A lot of people know about Wikipedia, but there's also Wiktionary, run by the same people, which is a great resource for, you can look up any word and it has the etymology of the word. It has words in other languages that are close to it or spelled the same way. And for the assignment that you'll do after this video about a word's etymology, it's a great place to start. So Wiktionary.org. So I looked up the word anima. And keep in mind, we have this relationship to the modern word animation. Here it is, anima. In Latin, that meant soul, spirit, or life. And also on a more literal level, it could mean air, breeze, or breath. So this is what I mean by, this is where the history of words gets fascinating. So if we have a more literal idea, like it was simply describing how people breathed at one point in Latin, or wind in the air or breeze, and you can see how breathing and the wind are related, right? At some point in Latin, this takes on a more metaphorical and spiritual meaning of soul, spirit, or life. And we can kind of see why that would be, right? Because like the breath that moves through our bodies is, in some sense, the spirit and the life, right? The soul. If that stops, that breathing stops, we no longer are alive. So right there, I find that fascinating that back in Latin, they made this connection between, soul, spirit, life, and then more physically, the air we breathe and the wind. So now what I'll ask you to do is think about how might this Latin word, meaning soul or breath, have something to do with animated films.